Jacob Worthington was a man whose life was defined by wealth, power, and an unshakable sense of control. At just 38, he had built a business empire from the ground up, owning several luxury hotels and real estate developments across the United States. His mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Manhattan, was a reflection of his success, modern, elegant, and meticulously maintained. But despite all the grandeur, there was an emptiness in Jacob's life that he couldn't quite explain. He had learned to bury it under layers of work and opulence. It was a cold, rainy evening when Jacob's life took an unexpected turn. He had just left a meeting with investors, feeling the usual mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. His driver, Marcus, was navigating through the wet streets of New York when Jacob noticed something unusual. At the corner of a dimly lit street, near an alley, a small figure sat huddled against the cold. "Marcus, stop the car," Jacob ordered, his voice filled with a rare sense of urgency. The car came to a halt, and Jacob stepped out, rain soaking through his tailored suit almost immediately. He approached the figure cautiously, realizing it was a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in tattered clothes, shivering uncontrollably. His hair was matted, and his face was streaked with dirt and tears. "What are you doing out here, kid?" Jacob asked, his voice softer than he intended. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. He didn't say a word, just pulled his knees closer to his chest, as if trying to disappear into the night. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," Jacob said, kneeling down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" The boy remained silent, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to come for him. But the street was empty, save for the occasional car passing by. Jacob could see that the boy was terrified and alone. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Jacob pressed gently, but the boy only shook his head, the motion so small it was almost imperceptible. Jacob stood up, his mind racing. He couldn't just leave the boy there. Something inside him, perhaps that long-buried emptiness, compelled him to act. He extended his hand to the boy. "Come with me. I'll help you," he offered. There was a long, tense moment where the boy just stared at Jacob's outstretched hand, uncertainty etched on his young face. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached out and took it. Jacob's grip was firm but reassuring. Back in the car, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, surprised but wisely choosing to remain silent. Jacob wrapped the boy in his coat, trying to warm him up as they drove towards the mansion. The boy said nothing the entire ride, his small body trembling despite the warmth. When they arrived at the estate, Jacob led the boy inside. The mansion, with its high ceilings and lavish decor, seemed to overwhelm him. He looked around, wide-eyed, as if he'd stepped into another world. "Let's get you cleaned up and something to eat," Jacob said, signaling to one of his housekeepers who had appeared in the doorway, equally shocked by the unexpected guest. "Prepare a guest room for him," Jacob instructed, "and bring some soup." The boy was taken upstairs, still clutching Jacob's coat as if it were a lifeline. Jacob watched as the housekeeper guided him away, feeling an odd sense of protectiveness he hadn't experienced in years. As the boy disappeared up the grand staircase, Jacob couldn't help but feel that this encounter was far from ordinary. There was something about the boy, something familiar that he couldn't quite place. But for now, the priority was making sure the child was safe and comfortable. Jacob headed to his study, where he planned to make a few calls to find out more about the boy. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why had he been alone on the streets? These questions swirled in Jacob's mind as he poured himself a drink, staring out the window into the dark, rainy night. Little did he know, this boy was about to turn his world upside down in ways he could never have imagined. Jacob didn't sleep much that night. His mind kept circling back to the boy now sleeping in a guest room down the hall. Something about the child's presence stirred emotions in Jacob that he had long since buried. He wasn't the type to take in strays, let alone bring a homeless child into his home. Yet here he was pacing in his study at midnight, wondering what to do next. He finally decided to check on the boy. Walking through the quiet corridors of his mansion, Jacob felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest. The house, usually filled with the soft hum of background music or the distant chatter of his staff, was eerily silent. When he reached the guest room door, He paused, almost hesitant to disturb the fragile peace within. He knocked softly and then opened the door. The room was dimly lit by a bedside lamp, casting a warm glow over the space. The boy was curled up in the enormous bed, the blankets pulled up to his chin, his small face barely visible beneath the layers. He looked so small, so vulnerable in that king-size bed. Jacob approached quietly, careful not to startle him. To his surprise, the boy was awake, his eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. He didn't react when Jacob sat down in the armchair beside the bed. "You can't sleep either, huh?" Jacob said, trying to keep his voice gentle. The boy slowly turned his head to look at him, but he still didn't say anything. Jacob could see the fear in his eyes, the confusion. It was the look of someone who had been through more than any child should have to endure. "What happened to you, kid?" Jacob asked softly, more to himself than to the boy. "Where are your parents?" At the mention of parents, something flickered in the boy's expression, a flash of pain, of something buried deep. But he quickly looked away, turning his gaze back to the ceiling. Jacob realized he wasn't going to get any answers tonight. "Look, you don't have to talk if you don't want to," Jacob continued, "but you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The boy's eyes darted back to Jacob, searching his face for any sign of deceit. Jacob just met his gaze with what he hoped was a reassuring look. After a long moment, the boy nodded slightly, just a small movement, but enough for Jacob to feel a flicker of relief. "Are you hungry?" Jacob asked, remembering he hadn't seen the boy eat since he arrived. "I can have something brought up if you want." The boy hesitated, then nodded again, more decisively this time. Jacob smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in what seemed like ages. "Okay, I'll be right back." Jacob left the room and headed downstairs to the kitchen. The house was so quiet that the sound of his footsteps echoed off the marble floors. When he reached the kitchen, he found Mrs. Walsh, the housekeeper, still awake, sipping tea at the counter. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as Jacob entered. "Neither can he," Jacob replied, gesturing upstairs. "Could you make him something to eat? Maybe some soup, if we have any." Mrs. Walsh nodded, her expression softening. "I'll bring it up to him. Poor thing, must be starving." Jacob watched as she busied herself with the task, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. He felt a strange sense of comfort in the routine, the familiarity of it all. Yet underneath that comfort was a growing unease, a feeling that something was about to change, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. A few minutes later, Mrs. Walsh handed Jacob a tray with a steaming bowl of soup, some bread, and a glass of milk. "Here you go," she said, her voice gentle. "Make sure he eats all of it. The boy looks like he hasn't had a proper meal in days." Jacob nodded and took the tray, heading back upstairs. When he re-entered the guest room, he found the boy sitting up in bed, his eyes tracking Jacob's every move. Jacob set the tray on the bedside table and handed the boy the bowl of soup. "Here, eat up," he said, sitting back in the armchair. The boy took the bowl in his small hands, the warmth of it seeming to calm him. He hesitated for a moment, then began to eat slowly, methodically, as if he were savoring every bite. Jacob watched in silence, a strange mix of emotions churning inside him. There was something achingly familiar about the boy, something he couldn't quite place. As the boy finished the soup, Jacob handed him the bread and the glass of milk. The boy accepted them, offering a small, tentative smile. It was the first time Jacob had seen any hint of joy on his face. "What's your name?" Jacob asked gently, hoping the boy might finally speak. The boy looked at him, hesitated, and then whispered, "Ethan." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The name echoed in his mind, stirring memories he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. There was something haunting about the way the boy said it, as if the name itself carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Ethan," Jacob repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's a good name." Ethan just nodded, his expression unreadable. Jacob wanted to ask him more, but he could see that the boy was exhausted, his eyelids drooping despite his best efforts to stay awake. "You should get some rest now," Jacob said softly, taking the empty bowl from Ethan's hands. "We'll talk more in the morning, okay?" Ethan nodded again, lying back down and pulling the blankets up to his chin. Jacob stood up, feeling an inexplicable urge to reach out and comfort the boy, but he held back, unsure of what to do. "Good night, Ethan," he said quietly as he turned to leave the room. As Jacob closed the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. But for now, all he could do was make sure Ethan was safe and hope that the morning would bring answers to the questions that were starting to consume him. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Jacob's bedroom, casting a warm glow across the luxurious space. But Jacob had been awake for hours, lying in bed with his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, the boy who had somehow ended up in his home and in his thoughts. The name Ethan had triggered something deep within him, stirring memories he had long buried. After tossing and turning, Jacob finally decided to get up. He needed to see Ethan to figure out what it was about the boy that felt so familiar. As he walked down the hallway toward the guest room, he rehearsed what he would say, though he wasn't sure what he was looking for. Answers, perhaps, or maybe just the truth behind the nagging feeling that wouldn't let him go. He knocked gently on the door before entering. To his surprise, Ethan was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring out the window. The boy seemed more at ease in the daylight, though there was still a guardedness in his eyes that Jacob couldn't ignore. "Good morning," Jacob greeted, trying to keep his tone light. "How did you sleep?" Ethan looked over at him and shrugged. "Okay, I guess." Jacob noticed the way Ethan's small hands were fidgeting with the edge of the blanket, a sign of nervousness. He decided to approach the conversation slowly, not wanting to scare the boy off. "Do you feel up to having some breakfast?" Jacob asked, sitting down in the armchair by the bed. "Mrs. Walsh makes the best pancakes. You'll like them." Ethan nodded, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "I like pancakes." "Good," Jacob said, relieved to see the boy opening up, even if just a little. "We can eat downstairs and then maybe we could talk a bit. I want to help you, Ethan, but I need to know more about you. Where you came from, who your family is." At the mention of family, Ethan's expression changed. The slight smile vanished, replaced by a look of sadness, almost fear. He looked away, his eyes focusing on something distant outside the window. "My family," Ethan began, his voice so quiet Jacob had to lean in to hear him. "They're gone." The simplicity of the statement hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. There was a finality in Ethan's words that spoke volumes about the loss and loneliness this boy had endured. Jacob felt a wave of sympathy for him, but he also knew he needed more information. "Do you remember anything about them?" Jacob asked gently. "Anything at all that could help us find out where you came from?" Ethan hesitated, biting his lower lip as if trying to hold back tears. I remember my mom. She used to sing to me when I was little. And my dad, he would take me to the park." His voice trembled, and he paused before adding, "But they're gone now. They've been gone a long time." Jacob's heart ached at the boy's words. He could see the pain etched into Ethan's young face, the weight of memories too heavy for a child to carry alone. Jacob wanted to press for more details, but he also knew he had to tread carefully. The last thing he wanted was to push Ethan away. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Jacob said softly. "I can't imagine how hard that must be." Ethan just nodded, his eyes still fixed on the view outside. Jacob decided to change the subject, sensing that the boy needed a break from the painful memories. "Why don't we go downstairs and get those pancakes?" Jacob suggested, standing up. "We could talk more later if you feel up to it." Ethan agreed with a slight nod, and Jacob led him downstairs to the dining room, where Mrs. Walsh had already laid out a generous breakfast spread. The smell of freshly cooked pancakes filled the room, and Jacob saw Ethan's eyes light up a little at the sight of the food. As they ate, Jacob watched Ethan closely, searching for clues in the boy's mannerisms, his expressions, anything that might explain the inexplicable connection Jacob felt to him. There was a familiarity about Ethan that Jacob couldn't shake, something in the way the boy moved, the way he spoke. But what was it? Halfway through the meal, Jacob decided to take a different approach. "Ethan, do you have anything with you? Like a backpack? Or something you were carrying when I found you?" Ethan paused mid-bite, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He swallowed and then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I had a backpack, but it's really old, and..." I don't know where it is. Jacob's curiosity piqued. Do you remember where you left it? Maybe we can go get it. Ethan seemed hesitant, but then he nodded. I think I left it in the alley, where you found me. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. If the backpack was still there, it might hold clues to Ethan's past. All right, Jacob said, keeping his tone calm. We'll go check it out after breakfast. When they finished eating, Jacob had Marcus prepare the car. They drove back to the alley where Jacob had first found Ethan, the city streets bustling with the energy of a new day. As they approached the alley, Jacob felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The alley looked even more desolate in the daylight. Trash littered the ground, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Ethan led the way, his small frame seeming even smaller against the backdrop of the grimy urban landscape. He pointed to a spot near a dumpster. I think I left it over there, he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Jacob walked over, scanning the area. There, half buried under some debris, was a worn-out backpack. He picked it up, feeling the weight of its contents, a weight that could be the key to unraveling Ethan's mystery. They returned to the car, and once they were inside, Jacob opened the backpack. Inside, he found a few basic items, a change of clothes, a crumpled piece of paper, and an old photograph. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he pulled out the photo. It was a faded image of a woman holding a baby, smiling warmly at the camera. Ethan leaned over to look, and his eyes filled with tears. That's my mom, he whispered. Jacob's hands trembled as he stared at the woman in the photo. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face. It was like looking into the past, a past Jacob had tried so hard to forget. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The woman in the photo looked just like his sister, the sister who had disappeared without a trace years ago. Ethan, Jacob's voice was thick with emotion. Your mom? Do you remember her name? Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Her name was Emily Worthington. Jacob felt the world shift beneath him. Emily Worthington, his sister's name, the sister who had vanished, leaving a hole in his life that had never healed. And now, sitting next to him in the car, was her son, his nephew. Everything started to make sense, the familiarity, the connection he couldn't explain. Jacob's heart raced as the reality of the situation sank in. This boy, this lost, frightened child, was family, and he had been out there on the streets alone all this time. Jacob swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. Ethan, I'm your uncle. I'm Jacob. Your mom, Emily, she's my sister. Ethan looked at him, confusion and shock mingling in his tear-filled eyes. You're my uncle? Yes, Jacob whispered, barely able to get the words out. You're my sister's son. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, Ethan. Ethan stared at him, the revelation too big to comprehend all at once. Jacob reached out, pulling the boy into a tight embrace, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I promise you, Ethan, Jacob said, his voice breaking. You're not alone anymore. I'm here now, and I'm never letting you go. And for the first time since he'd found Ethan, Jacob felt a sense of purpose, a determination to protect this boy, his nephew, no matter what it took. The drive back to the mansion was heavy with silence, the air between Jacob and Ethan thick with unspoken emotions. Jacob kept glancing at the boy, who was staring out the window, processing the bombshell that had just been dropped on him. It was as if the world had shifted, and neither of them knew how to find solid ground again. When they arrived at the mansion, Jacob instructed Marcus to take the afternoon off. He needed time alone with Ethan to start unraveling the tangled web of their shared past. As they entered the mansion, the grandeur of the place seemed to press in on them, its opulence a stark contrast to the emotional storm brewing inside. Jacob led Ethan to his study, a room that had always been his sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes that had once provided Jacob with an escape from the burdens of his life. But today, there would be no escape. Today, he had to face the truth head-on. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the massive oak door. Jacob turned to him, offering a reassuring smile. Come on in, Ethan. We need to talk. Ethan entered slowly, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for something familiar, something to anchor him in this strange, new reality. Jacob gestured for him to sit on the leather sofa, and Ethan obeyed, sinking into the soft cushions. Jacob sat across from him, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Ethan," Jacob began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know this is a lot to take in. Finding out you have an uncle you never knew about. It's overwhelming. But I need you to understand that I didn't know about you. If I had, I would have found you sooner." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "I don't remember much," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just bits and pieces like my mom's smile and the way she used to sing to me at night. But I don't remember you." Jacob's heart ached at the boy's words. How could he explain the years of pain, the unanswered questions, the desperate search for his sister that had led to nothing? He had thought she was lost forever, and now, here was her son, alive and in need of answers. "You wouldn't remember me," Jacob said gently. "You were just a baby when your mom disappeared. I didn't even know she had a child until today." Ethan looked down at his hands, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. What happened to her? Why did she leave? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud, one that Jacob had dreaded ever since he realized who Ethan was. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the truth. "Your mom? Emily," Jacob began, choosing his words carefully. "She was my younger sister. We were very close growing up, but when she was in her early 20s, something changed. She started acting differently, keeping secrets. I knew something was wrong, but she wouldn't tell me what it was." Jacob paused, the memories flooding back like a torrent. He could still see Emily's face, the way she had smiled through the pain, hiding whatever darkness had entered her life. "One day, she just disappeared," Jacob continued, his voice thick with emotion. "No warning, no goodbye. I searched for her everywhere, hired private investigators, talked to everyone she knew. But it was like she vanished into thin air." Ethan looked up at Jacob, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Did you ever find her?" Jacob shook his head, the bitterness of failure still sharp after all these years. "No, Ethan, I never found her. But now I think I know why." Ethan leaned forward, his young face etched with a seriousness that seemed out of place for a boy his age. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jacob swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "I think she was running from someone, and I think she was trying to protect you." The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow. He sank back into the sofa, his eyes brimming with tears. "She was protecting me," he whispered, as if the idea was too much to comprehend. Jacob nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Yes, Ethan, she must have been. I don't know the details yet, but I promise you we'll find out. I'll do whatever it takes to get to the bottom of this." Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to be brave. Do you think she's still alive?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and dread. Jacob wished he could give Ethan the answer he so desperately wanted, but he knew better than to offer false hope. "I don't know, Ethan," Jacob said honestly, "but I'm going to find out, and if she is, we'll bring her back." Ethan nodded, his face a mixture of resolve and fear. He had lost so much already, and the possibility of losing more was almost too much to bear. But he trusted Jacob, his uncle, the man who had found him when he was lost and alone. If anyone could find the truth, it was him. As they sat in the quiet of the study, Jacob felt a determination unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He had spent years building his empire, thinking that wealth and success were the only things that mattered. But now, with Ethan in his life, everything had changed. Jacob knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and dangers he couldn't yet foresee. But he also knew that he couldn't turn back. He had found Ethan, his nephew, his family, and he wasn't about to lose him again. "We'll figure this out together," Jacob said, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore, Ethan. You have me, and I promise I'll take care of you." Ethan looked up at Jacob, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something Jacob hadn't seen in him before. It was a glimmer of hope, fragile and tentative, but they're all the same. "Thank you, Uncle Jacob," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob smiled, his heart swelling with a protectiveness he had never felt before. You're welcome, Ethan. Now, let's start finding some answers. And with that, Jacob knew there was no turning back. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with uncertainty, but he would face it head-on, for Ethan's sake and for Emily's. He owed it to both of them to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. And he would stop at nothing to bring them both back where they belonged, safe and together. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations for both Jacob and Ethan. Jacob had never imagined that his life would take such a drastic turn. Just a week ago, he was a wealthy, driven man with a singular focus on his business empire. Now, he was consumed by the need to uncover the truth about his sister's disappearance and the circumstances that had led to Ethan ending up alone on the streets. Jacob began his search by contacting the private investigator he had hired years ago to find Emily. The man, a seasoned professional named Frank Harrington, had exhausted every lead back then, but Jacob hoped that new technology and fresh eyes might bring something to light. Frank met Jacob at the mansion the following morning. His gray hair and worn face reflected the years he had spent chasing down the most elusive of leads, but his eyes still held a sharpness that spoke of his determination. "Jacob," Frank greeted with a firm handshake. "It's been a long time. I never expected to be back here under these circumstances." "Neither did I," Jacob admitted, leading Frank into the study where Ethan sat waiting. "But things have changed. I found my sister's son, Frank. This is Ethan." Frank's eyes widened in surprise as he looked at the boy. "Emily's son?" he asked, astonishment clear in his voice. "I had no idea she had a child." "Neither did I," Jacob said, his voice tight with the weight of the revelation. "But now that we know, I need your help more than ever. We need to find out what happened to Emily, and if she's still out there." Frank nodded, his demeanor turning serious. "I'll do everything I can, Jacob, but I have to be honest with you. It's going to be difficult. It's been years since she disappeared, and if she was hiding from someone, well, that could mean anything." "I know it won't be easy," Jacob replied, his determination unwavering. "But we have to try. I owe it to Ethan and to Emily." Frank agreed and wasted no time getting started. He had a list of contacts, places to start looking, and a plan to dig deeper into Emily's past than he ever had before. As Frank got to work, Jacob turned his attention back to Ethan, who was quietly observing the exchange. "How are you holding up, buddy?" Jacob asked, sitting down beside Ethan. Ethan shrugged, a small, unsure smile on his face. "It's a lot to take in," he admitted, "but I'm okay. I just want to know what happened to my mom." Jacob placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We'll find out, I promise. But you have to be patient. Frank is the best, and he'll do everything he can to get us answers." Ethan nodded, though Jacob could see the anxiety in his eyes. It was clear that the boy was struggling to process everything that was happening, but Jacob was determined to help him through it. Over the next few days, Frank's investigation began to uncover pieces of a puzzle that had long been hidden. He found records of Emily's last known whereabouts, including a small apartment she had rented under a false name in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was the first real lead they had in years. Jacob and Frank decided to visit the apartment together, hoping to find something, anything, that might give them more insight into Emily's life before she vanished. They didn't bring Ethan along, not wanting to expose him to the darker side of his mother's past. When they arrived at the apartment building, Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. The place was old and run down, with peeling paint and cracked windows. It was hard to imagine his sister, who had once been full of life and ambition, living in such a desolate place. But Jacob knew better than to judge by appearances. Emily had clearly been hiding, and this was where she had chosen to disappear. They knocked on the door of the apartment, but there was no answer. Frank used his connections to gain access to the apartment, and they entered cautiously. The inside was as dreary as the exterior, with bare walls and minimal furniture. It was clear that whoever had lived here had left in a hurry. Jacob's heart sank as he looked around the empty room. There were no personal items, no photos, nothing that indicated who had lived here, except for one thing. On the kitchen counter, beneath a thin layer of dust, was an old, worn notebook. Jacob picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, some of them crossed out, others written hastily as if in a moment of panic. There were lists of places, names that Jacob didn't recognize, and one name that was repeated over and over: Jonathan. "Frank, look at this," Jacob said, his voice tight with tension as he handed the notebook to the investigator. Frank took the notebook, scanning the pages quickly. "Jonathan," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "This name keeps coming up. Whoever he is, he was important to Emily. But who is he?" Jacob's mind raced as he tried to recall anyone by that name from Emily's past, but nothing came to him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she mentioned him this many times, he must be connected to whatever she was running from." Frank nodded, closing the notebook with a decisive snap. "I'll look into it. This could be the lead we've been waiting for." As they left the apartment, Jacob's thoughts were consumed by the name Jonathan. Who was this man, and how did he fit into Emily's life? More importantly, could he still be out there, the key to finding out what had happened to her? That evening, back at the mansion, Jacob sat with Ethan in the living room. They had been spending a lot of time together, growing closer as they navigated this new reality. Jacob had been careful to shield Ethan from the more distressing details of the investigation, but he knew he couldn't keep everything from the boy. "Ethan," Jacob began gently, "we found something at the apartment your mom used to live in. A notebook with some notes she left behind." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Did it say where she is?" Jacob shook his head, his heart aching for the boy. "Not exactly, but it mentioned someone named Jonathan. We don't know who he is yet, but Frank is going to find out." Ethan frowned, trying to make sense of the information. "Jonathan? I don't remember anyone by that name." "That's okay," Jacob reassured him. "We'll figure it out together. This is just the first step." Ethan nodded, his small hands clenched in a fist on his lap. "I just want to know the truth," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I know," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we will. I promise you, Ethan, we'll find out what happened to your mom, and we'll make sure you're safe." As they sat together in the quiet of the mansion, Jacob realized that this journey was only just beginning. The discovery of the notebook had opened up a new path, one that might finally lead them to the answers they sought. But with every step forward, Jacob knew they were also stepping into dangerous territory that could reveal dark truths he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But for Ethan's sake, and for the memory of his sister, Jacob knew he had to keep going, no matter what they uncovered along the way. He wasn't just fighting for answers. He was fighting for family, for the only family he had left. And he would stop at nothing to bring them both the peace they deserved. Days turned into a week, and the investigation into Emily's disappearance grew more intense with each passing day. Frank Harrington was relentless, diving deep into old records, re-interviewing people who had known Emily, and following every lead, no matter how small. The name Jonathan was at the center of it all, a shadowy figure whose identity remained elusive. Jacob spent every spare moment with Ethan, trying to create a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. They developed a routine: breakfast together, homeschooling sessions with a private tutor, and evenings spent playing chess or watching movies. But beneath the surface, both of them were on edge, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and saw Frank's name. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. "Frank, what did you find?" Jacob asked, his voice tense with anticipation. "I've got something, Jacob," Frank replied, his tone serious. "I tracked down Jonathan. His full name is Jonathan Reed, and he has a history, one that might explain everything." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. "Who is he?" Frank hesitated before answering, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Jonathan Reed is a name that came up in connection with a criminal organization about a decade ago. He was involved in some very shady dealings, money laundering, fraud, and most notably human trafficking. He was never convicted, but he's been on law enforcement's radar for years." Jacob felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The words human trafficking echoed in his mind, filling him with dread. "Do you think he had something to do with Emily's disappearance?" "It's possible," Frank replied. We're still piecing it together, but it looks like Emily might have gotten involved with him, willingly or not. If she was trying to protect Ethan, it would make sense that she went underground. She might have been running from him. Jacob's mind raced, trying to process the information. The idea that his sister had been caught up in something so dark, so dangerous, was almost too much to bear. But it also made sense. It explained why she had vanished, why she had hidden Ethan from the world. "Where is he now?" Jacob asked, his voice tight with tension. "That's the tricky part," Frank admitted. "Jonathan's gone off the grid. He's a ghost, living under the radar. But I've got a few leads on people who might know where he is. I'm following up on them now." Jacob clenched his fist, a surge of anger and determination rising within him. "We have to find him, Frank. If he's responsible for what happened to Emily, we need to bring him to justice. And if there's any chance she's still alive—" "I understand, Jacob," Frank said, his voice firm. "I'll keep you updated. But be careful. If Jonathan Reed is as dangerous as he seems, we're dealing with a very serious threat." After the call ended, Jacob sat in silence, his mind racing with the implications of what Frank had discovered. He had always known that Emily's disappearance was more than a simple case of a runaway, but he hadn't expected it to be tied to something so sinister. The thought of his sister being trapped in a world of crime and danger, possibly even now, made his blood run cold. Just then, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his small figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He had been watching Jacob closely over the past few days, sensing that something was happening, even if he didn't know all the details. "Uncle Jacob," Ethan said softly, "did you find out anything about my mom?" Jacob looked at Ethan, the boy's wide eyes full of hope and fear. He wanted to shield Ethan from the worst of it, but he also knew that keeping him in the dark wasn't fair. Ethan had a right to know what was happening. He was the reason they were fighting so hard for answers. "We found out a little more," Jacob said, his voice gentle. "There's a man named Jonathan Reed. We think he might have been involved in what happened to your mom." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. "Involved how?" Jacob hesitated, searching for the right words. "Jonathan Reed is a bad man, Ethan. He's been involved in some dangerous things, and we think your mom might have been trying to get away from him." Ethan's eyes widened, and Jacob could see the fear creeping into his expression. "Was he after her? Is that why she left?" Jacob nodded slowly. "We think so, but we're going to find out for sure. Frank is looking for him right now, and when we find him, we'll get the answers we need." Ethan was silent for a long moment, processing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and shaky. "Do you think she's still alive?" Jacob's heart twisted at the question. He wanted to give Ethan the hope he so desperately needed, but he also couldn't lie to him. "I don't know, Ethan, but I promise you, we're doing everything we can to find her. And no matter what, you're not alone in this." Ethan nodded, though Jacob could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The boy was trying to be brave, but Jacob knew how much he was struggling. The weight of it all, the loss, the fear, the unknown, was too much for a child to bear alone. Jacob crossed the room and knelt down in front of Ethan, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together, okay? You, me, and Frank. We're going to find out the truth, and we're going to make sure you're safe." Ethan looked up at Jacob, his eyes filled with a mixture of trust and vulnerability. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Jacob sat in his study, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The silence of the mansion felt oppressive, the grandeur of the space doing little to alleviate the heaviness in his heart. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he stared into the glass. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions: anger at Jonathan Reed for what he had done, fear for what might happen next, and a deep, aching sadness for his sister and the life she might have endured. As he took a sip, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Frank. "Asterisk, I've got a lead. I'm heading out tonight to follow up. We'll keep you posted." Asterisk. Jacob's grip tightened around the glass. This was it, the lead they had been waiting for. But with it came a growing sense of dread. They were stepping into dangerous territory, and Jacob knew that if they weren't careful, they could be putting themselves and Ethan in even greater danger. But there was no turning back now. They were too close to the truth, too close to finding out what had happened to Emily. And Jacob was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his family, even if it meant facing the darkest shadows of the past. As he finished his drink, Jacob made a silent vow. He would find Jonathan Reed, uncover the truth, and bring his sister back, alive or dead. He owed it to Emily, to Ethan, and to himself, and he would not rest until justice was served. With that thought, Jacob stood up, his resolve hardening into steel. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but he was ready to face whatever came next, ready to protect Ethan at all costs, and ready to bring an end to the nightmare that had haunted his family for so long. And as he turned off the lights and headed to bed, one thought echoed in his mind: this ends now. The following day dawned with a sense of foreboding that clung to the air like a heavy mist. Jacob awoke early, the unease from the night before still gnawing at him. He had barely slept, his mind too restless with thoughts of Emily, Jonathan Reed, and what Frank might uncover. Every passing minute felt like a step closer to a confrontation that he wasn't sure he was ready for, but one that he knew was inevitable. He found Ethan already awake, sitting quietly at the breakfast table, staring down at his plate of untouched food. Jacob's heart tightened at the sight. The boy had been through so much, and now, with the revelations about Jonathan Reed, the weight of uncertainty was pressing down on him even more. "Morning, buddy," Jacob said gently as he sat down across from Ethan. "Not hungry?" Ethan looked up, his eyes shadowed with worry. "I don't feel like eating," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob sighed, understanding all too well. He reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's. "I know this is hard, Ethan, but you have to keep your strength up, okay? We've got a long road ahead of us." Ethan nodded, but Jacob could see the fear and doubt in his eyes. The boy was trying to be brave, but the cracks were starting to show. And Jacob knew that the only way to help him was to stay strong himself, no matter how uncertain things became. As they finished breakfast in silence, Jacob's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Frank. "Got something. Meet me at the location I'm sending you, alone." Jacob's pulse quickened. This was it. Frank had found something important enough to warrant a face-to-face meeting. But the instruction to come alone set off alarm bells in Jacob's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something dangerous. "I have to go out for a bit," Jacob told Ethan, trying to keep his tone casual. "Frank found a lead, and I need to meet him." Ethan's eyes widened with concern. "Can I come with you?" Jacob hesitated, torn between wanting to protect Ethan and the need to keep him safe. "Not this time, Ethan. It might not be safe, but I'll be back as soon as I can, okay?" Ethan looked disappointed but nodded. "Be careful." "I will," Jacob promised, giving Ethan's hand a reassuring squeeze before he stood to leave. As he drove through the city, following the directions Frank had sent, Jacob's mind raced with possibilities. What had Frank found? Could it be the key to finding Emily? Or was it something more dangerous, something that could put them all at risk? The address led Jacob to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that seemed to have long been abandoned. The windows were boarded up and the paint was peeling off the walls. It was the kind of place where secrets were kept and where danger lurked in the shadows. Jacob parked his car and stepped out, the cold wind biting through his coat. He scanned the area, his senses on high alert. The warehouse loomed before him, a silent, imposing figure against the gray sky. Frank was waiting for him near the entrance, his expression tense. Jacob could see the strain in his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched as if bracing for something. "Frank," Jacob greeted, his voice low. "What did you find?" Frank glanced around, ensuring they were alone before he spoke. "It's not good, Jacob. I've been digging into Jonathan Reed's past, and what I found, it's worse than we thought." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. "Tell me." "Jonathan Reed wasn't just involved in human trafficking," Frank said, his voice grim. "He ran the whole operation. He's been linked to multiple disappearances, women and children who were never found. Emily, she wasn't the first." Jacob felt a surge of anger and fear. "And now he's after Ethan?" Frank nodded, his expression dark. "It looks that way. I think Emily took Ethan and ran because she knew what Jonathan was capable of. She was trying to protect him, but something went wrong. I found records of a confrontation between them just before she disappeared. There was a police report, an anonymous tip about a domestic disturbance, but when the cops arrived, they found nothing. It was like they had vanished into thin air. Jacob's mind raced, trying to piece together the timeline. And no one followed up? Not officially, Frank replied. But I found someone who did. A woman who used to work with Jonathan. Someone who got out before things got too deep. She's scared, but she agreed to meet with us. Jacob narrowed his eyes, suspicion gnawing at him. Where is she? She's inside, Frank said, nodding toward the warehouse. But we have to be careful. She's paranoid, thinks she's being watched. Jacob felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. If this woman had information that could lead them to Emily, they had to take the risk. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that they were stepping into a trap. Let's go, Jacob said, his voice firm. They entered the warehouse, the interior dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. The only light came from a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Frank led the way, guiding Jacob through a maze of old machinery and rusted metal. The place was a labyrinth, designed to disorient and confuse anyone who didn't know their way around. Jacob's heart raced as they navigated the narrow corridors, every nerve on edge. Finally, they reached a small, dimly lit room at the back of the warehouse. A woman was sitting in a chair, her face hidden in the shadows. She was thin, her hair disheveled, and her hands trembled as she fidgeted with the hem of her coat. This is Maria, Frank introduced, his voice soft. She used to work for Jonathan. She's the one who tipped me off about the confrontation with Emily. Jacob stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the woman. Maria, I'm Jacob Worthington. I need to know what happened to my sister. Maria looked up, her eyes wide and filled with fear. I don't know everything, she stammered, her voice shaking. But I know enough to tell you that you're in danger. Jonathan, he doesn't let people go. If Emily crossed him, he wouldn't have stopped until he found her. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Is she still alive? Maria's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, Jacob thought she wouldn't answer. Then she whispered, I don't know, but I know she fought like hell to protect her son. She was strong, determined. If anyone could survive, it would be her. But Jonathan, he's dangerous, Jacob. He won't stop until he has what he wants. What does he want? Jacob demanded, his voice tight with anger. Maria looked up, her eyes filled with a haunted fear. Ethan. He wants Ethan. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was a nightmare brought to life. Jonathan Reed wanted Ethan, and if he was as dangerous as Maria said, then Ethan's life was in grave danger. Jacob felt a surge of protectiveness, his resolve hardening. He's not going to get him, he said, his voice low and fierce. I'll make sure of that. Maria's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and hope. You have to be careful, Jacob. Jonathan has eyes everywhere. If he knows you're looking for him, he'll come after you. Jacob's mind raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to protect Ethan at all costs, but he also had to find Jonathan and put an end to this nightmare. Do you know where he is? Jacob asked, his voice calm but urgent. Maria shook her head, her expression pained. No, he moves around a lot, never stays in one place for long. But there's a man, one of his old associates. He might know where Jonathan is hiding. I can give you his name. Jacob's heart pounded as he realized this might be their only lead. Tell me, he urged. Maria hesitated for a moment, then whispered, his name is Vincent Marino. He's a low-level thug, but he knows things. If anyone can lead you to Jonathan, it's him. Jacob nodded, determination burning in his chest. He had a name, a lead. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He would find Vincent Marino, and through him, he would find Jonathan Reed. And when he did, he would end this once and for all. Thank you, Maria, Jacob said, his voice steady. You've done the right thing. Maria looked up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. Please, Jacob, be careful. Jonathan, he's not like other men. He's ruthless, and he won't hesitate to kill to get what he wants. Jacob nodded, his jaw set with resolve. I know, but I'm not going to let him hurt Ethan or anyone else. As they left the warehouse, Jacob's mind was already racing with plans. He needed to find Vincent Marino and fast. Time was running out, and the longer they waited, the greater the risk to Ethan and to Emily if she was still alive. But one thing was certain: Jacob wasn't going to let Jonathan Reed win. He would fight with everything he had to protect his family, even if it meant putting himself in the crosshairs of a dangerous man. As he drove back to the mansion, his thoughts were consumed by the battle ahead. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but Jacob was determined to come out on top. For Ethan, for Emily, and for the justice they both deserved. And as the city lights blurred by outside the car window, Jacob made a silent vow. This ends with me. Jacob drove through the city streets with a singular focus: find Vincent Marino. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing through the possibilities. If Marino was the key to finding Jonathan Reed, then Jacob would do whatever it took to track him down. He had promised Ethan that he would keep him safe, and Jacob intended to keep that promise. The address Maria had given them led Jacob to a seedy part of town, far from the polished skyscrapers and affluent neighborhoods he was accustomed to. This was a place where the rules were different, where danger lurked in every shadow. Jacob knew he was out of his element, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. Ethan's life depended on it. He parked his car in an alley and walked the rest of the way, his senses on high alert. The buildings were old and dilapidated, their walls covered in graffiti. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and decay, and the streets were eerily quiet. Jacob kept his head down, blending into the shadows as he made his way to the address Maria had provided. The building he sought was a rundown apartment complex, its windows boarded up and its front door hanging off its hinges. Jacob hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him that this could be a trap. But he had no choice. He had to find Marino, and this was the only lead he had. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The lobby was dark and empty, the air stale and oppressive. Jacob could hear the faint sound of a television somewhere in the distance, but there was no sign of anyone else. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles as he made his way to the stairs. Maria had told him that Marino lived on the third floor in apartment 3C. Jacob climbed the stairs quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the third floor and found the hallway deserted, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the far end. The door to apartment 3C was slightly ajar, and Jacob could feel his pulse quicken as he approached. He pushed the door open cautiously, revealing a small, dingy apartment. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and alcohol. The furniture was sparse and battered, and the walls were covered in grime. In the center of the room, slumped in a threadbare armchair, was a man who could only be Vincent Marino. Marino was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a paunch that hung over his belt. His face was lined with years of hard living, and his eyes were bloodshot from too much drink. He looked up as Jacob entered, his gaze unfocused and bleary. "Who the hell are you?" Marino slurred, his voice rough and gravelly. Jacob stepped forward, his tone firm. "My name is Jacob Worthington. I'm here to talk about Jonathan Reed." At the mention of Reed's name, Marino's eyes narrowed, and he sat up a little straighter. "What do you want with Jonathan?" "I need to find him," Jacob replied, keeping his voice steady. "And I think you know where he is." Marino let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think I'm just going to tell you? You have no idea who you're messing with, pal." Jacob stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I know what he's done. Now, you can either help me, or I can make things very difficult for you." Marino's eyes flickered with fear, but he tried to mask it with bravado. "You don't scare me. You think you could just walk in here and demand answers? You're out of your league." Jacob's patience was wearing thin. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Listen to me, Marino," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Jonathan Reed is after my nephew, and if you don't help me, I'll make sure every law enforcement agency in this city knows exactly where to find you. You'll never be able to hide again." Marino's bravado faltered, and Jacob could see the fear creeping into his eyes. "What's it worth to you?" Marino asked, his voice trembling slightly. Jacob knew this was his chance. If you help me find Jonathan, I'll make sure you're protected. You'll be out of his reach, and you'll get a fresh start. But if you don't, he let the threat hang in the air, knowing Marino would understand. For a long moment, Marino was silent, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed heavily and slumped back in his chair. All right. I'll tell you what I know, but you didn't hear it from me. Got it? Jacob nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation. Where is he? Marino took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. Jonathan's got a safe house, one of his many. It's an old warehouse near the docks. He uses it for meetings, for hiding people, for things you don't want to know about. If he's holed up anywhere, it'll be there. Jacob's mind raced as he processed the information. The docks were a rough area, full of abandoned buildings and dark corners where someone could easily disappear. But if Marino was right, it was the best lead they had. Thank you, Jacob said, his voice sincere. You've done the right thing. Marino waved him off, his expression weary. Just get out of here. And if anyone asks, I didn't say anything. Jacob nodded and turned to leave, but Marino's voice stopped him at the door. Hey, Worthington, Marino called out, his tone serious. Be careful. Jonathan's not the kind of guy you can just take down. He's got connections, power, and he's ruthless. If you go after him, you better be ready to go all the way. Jacob looked back at Marino, his resolve unshaken. I am. With that, he left the apartment, his mind already focused on the next step. He had a location, a place where Jonathan might be hiding. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before. And it was enough to keep moving forward. As he made his way back to his car, Jacob's thoughts turned to Ethan. He had promised to protect the boy, to keep him safe from the danger that threatened to engulf them both. But now, with Jonathan Reed in his sights, Jacob knew that the real battle was just beginning. He would have to be careful, strategic. One wrong move could put Ethan in even greater danger. But Jacob was ready. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. The drive to the mansion was a blur, Jacob's mind racing with plans and contingencies. He needed to call Frank, to let him know what he had found, and to prepare for what came next. But most of all, he needed to be ready, to face Jonathan Reed, to protect Ethan, and to bring an end to the nightmare that had haunted their lives for so long. As he pulled up to the mansion, Jacob felt a renewed sense of determination. He was close, so close to finding out the truth, to putting an end to the fear and uncertainty that had plagued them. But he also knew that the final confrontation would be the most dangerous part of all. He entered the mansion, finding Ethan in the living room, reading a book. The boy looked up as Jacob walked in, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Did you find him? Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. Not yet, Jacob replied, sitting down beside him. But we're close, Ethan. We're going to find Jonathan, and we're going to stop him. I promise you that. Ethan nodded, trying to muster a smile, but Jacob could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. I'm scared, Uncle Jacob. Jacob's heart ached at the boy's words. He wished he could take away Ethan's fear, shield him from the darkness that threatened to consume them. But all he could do was offer his unwavering support and love. I know you are, buddy, Jacob said softly, pulling Ethan into a comforting embrace. But you're not alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this together. Ethan clung to Jacob, his small body trembling with the weight of everything he had been through. And in that moment, Jacob made a silent vow to himself. No matter what it took, he would protect this boy. He would find Jonathan Reed, uncover the truth about Emily, and bring an end to the nightmare that had torn their lives apart. As the night descended on the mansion, Jacob's mind was already racing with plans. Tomorrow, they would move forward, toward the final confrontation, toward the truth. But for now, he held Ethan close, offering the boy the only comfort he could, the promise that they would face whatever came next together as a family. And as they sat together in the quiet of the mansion, Jacob knew that the endgame was near. The pieces were in place, the final showdown looming on the horizon. But he was ready, ready to fight, ready to protect, ready to do whatever it took to bring justice to those he loved. This was the calm before the storm, and Jacob Worthington was prepared to weather whatever came next. Because for him, there was no other option. This was his family, his life, and he would stop at nothing to ensure that they came out the other side whole. No matter what it took. Jacob's night was restless, filled with anxiety about the impending confrontation. Sleep eluded him as he constantly pictured Ethan's terrified face. By dawn, his anxiety gave way to determination. Today would change everything. He briefed Frank early about the plan. They would approach the warehouse where Jonathan Reed might be hiding. Frank, cautious as ever, agreed to provide backup but emphasized the risks. They couldn't delay. Ethan's safety was at stake. Before leaving, Jacob reassured Ethan, who was scared but promised to stay safe at home. After a tight embrace, Jacob left, knowing the weight of what he was about to face. As Jacob and Frank reached the desolate docks, they approached the rusted warehouse cautiously. Inside, they found Jonathan waiting, surrounded by his men. Jonathan's mocking tone revealed he had been expecting Jacob, but Jacob's fury boiled over when Jonathan hinted that Emily was gone and Ethan was next. Jacob lunged at Jonathan in a fit of rage, but his men quickly subdued him. Jonathan's smugness grew as he revealed his men were already en route to kidnap Ethan. Desperation gave Jacob the strength to break free and attack Jonathan again, but he was quickly overpowered. Just as things seemed dire, Frank's backup team stormed the warehouse, triggering a chaotic firefight. Jonathan tried to escape, but Jacob chased him outside, tackling him to the ground. Fueled by years of pain, Jacob relentlessly beat Jonathan, ensuring he could never harm anyone again. Frank's arrival halted Jacob's assault just in time. Bloody but determined, Jacob learned that Jonathan's men were indeed heading for the mansion. Panic set in. Ethan was in grave danger. Without hesitation, Jacob and Frank raced back to the mansion, Jacob praying they weren't too late. As they sped through the night, his thoughts were singular: save Ethan. Jacob's foot pressed hard on the gas pedal, the car speeding through the dark, empty streets. Frank sat beside him, coordinating with the backup team through the radio. The urgency in the air was palpable, every second ticking by with the weight of a ticking bomb. They had to reach the mansion before Jonathan's men did, before they could take Ethan. Jacob's mind was a storm of fear and determination. He couldn't lose Ethan, not after everything they'd been through. The boy had already lost so much: his mother, his sense of safety, his childhood innocence. Jacob refused to let him lose anything more. He refused to let Jonathan win. As they neared the mansion, the road ahead was eerily quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows over the pavement. Jacob's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white as they pulled up to the front gates. The sight of the towering iron gates, usually a symbol of security, now filled Jacob with dread. "We need to be ready," Frank warned, his voice tense. "There's no telling how many men Jonathan sent or how desperate they are. We can't afford any mistakes." Jacob nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. "We'll protect him, no matter what." They parked the car just inside the gates and hurried toward the mansion. The massive house loomed in the darkness, its windows glowing with faint light. Everything seemed normal on the outside, but Jacob knew that danger lurked nearby. Frank led the way, his gun drawn as they entered the mansion through a side door. The interior was silent, the only sound the echo of their footsteps on the polished marble floors. Jacob's heart raced as they moved through the halls, every shadow and corner a potential threat. "Ethan," Jacob called out, his voice urgent but controlled. "Ethan, where are you?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the mansion. Jacob's pulse quickened, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if they were already too late? What if Jonathan's men had already? A sudden noise shattered the silence, a loud crash from upstairs. Jacob and Frank exchanged a tense glance before sprinting toward the staircase, taking the steps two at a time. They reached the landing just as the door to Ethan's room burst open. Jacob's heart nearly stopped as he saw two men, Jonathan's thugs, forcing their way into the room, their eyes wild and desperate. "Ethan!" Jacob shouted, his voice filled with raw panic. The boy's terrified scream echoed through the hall, fueling Jacob's rage. Without a second thought, he charged at the men, his only focus on getting them away from Ethan. Frank was right behind him, his gun trained on the intruders. "Get away from him!" Frank barked, his voice authoritative and deadly. One of the men turned, pulling a gun from his waistband, but Frank was faster. A single shot rang out, and the man crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. The second man hesitated, his eyes darting between Frank's gun and Jacob's advancing form. Jacob didn't give him a chance to react. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground with all the force of his pent-up fury. The impact sent them both crashing into the wall, but Jacob didn't relent. He grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the wall again and again until the thug was dazed and disarmed. With the immediate threat neutralized, Jacob's focus snapped back to Ethan. The boy was huddled in the corner of the room, his eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down his face. "Ethan," Jacob breathed, rushing to his side. He dropped to his knees, pulling the boy into a protective embrace. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe now." Ethan clung to Jacob, his small body trembling violently. "I was so scared," he sobbed, his voice muffled against Jacob's chest. They tried to take me." Jacob's heart broke at the fear in Ethan's voice. He tightened his hold on the boy, pressing a reassuring kiss to the top of his head. "I know, buddy, but you're safe now. I promise you, they won't hurt you. Not ever again." Frank moved quickly, securing the two men and ensuring that no more intruders were in the house. The rest of the backup team arrived moments later, sweeping the mansion and confirming that it was secure. As the tension in the air began to ease, Jacob pulled back slightly, cupping Ethan's tear-streaked face in his hands. "You were so brave, Ethan. I'm so proud of you." Ethan sniffled, trying to hold back more tears. I thought they were going to take me away. I didn't know what to do." Jacob's chest tightened with a fierce protectiveness. "You did exactly what you should have. You stayed strong. And now it's over. No one is going to take you away. Not now, not ever." Ethan nodded, his grip on Jacob not loosening. It was as if he feared letting go would somehow make him vulnerable again. Jacob understood that fear all too well. He felt it too. But he also knew they had to move forward to ensure this nightmare never repeated itself. Frank rejoined them, his face lined with concern. "The house is clear. The rest of Jonathan's men have been apprehended. But Jacob, we need to talk about what happens next." Jacob nodded, still holding Ethan close. "We can't stay here. Jonathan might be down, but he's not out. We need to get Ethan somewhere safe." Frank agreed, his expression grave. "I'll make arrangements. We can put you both in protective custody, keep you off the radar until we've dealt with Jonathan for good." Ethan looked up at Jacob, his eyes wide with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "Will we be okay, Uncle Jacob? Will we be safe?" Jacob met Ethan's gaze, his heart swelling with love and determination. "Yes, Ethan, we're going to be okay. We'll be safe. I'll make sure of it." Frank stepped outside to make the necessary calls, leaving Jacob and Ethan alone in the room. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to wear off, leaving Jacob feeling both exhausted and relieved. He sat down on the edge of Ethan's bed, pulling the boy up beside him. "I know this has been really scary, Ethan, but it's over now. We're going to leave here and go somewhere safe. And I'll be with you every step of the way." Ethan leaned against Jacob, his head resting on his uncle's shoulder. "I just want it to be over," he whispered. "I want to feel safe again." Jacob's heart ached for the boy's lost innocence, for the childhood that had been ripped away by the horrors of the past. But he also felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to give Ethan the safety and security he deserved. "It will be Ethan," Jacob promised, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm going to make sure of that. We're going to start over, somewhere new, somewhere where no one can hurt us." Ethan nodded, comforted by Jacob's words. "Will we be together?" "Always," Jacob replied, wrapping his arm around Ethan's shoulders. "You're my family, Ethan, and nothing is ever going to change that." As the night wore on, Jacob stayed by Ethan's side, watching over him as the boy finally drifted off to sleep. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a prison, one that they would soon leave behind. There was a future waiting for them, one where they could be free from the shadows of the past. And as Jacob sat there in the quiet room, listening to the soft sounds of Ethan's breathing, he knew that he had made the right choice. Family was what mattered most, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. When Frank returned, he found Jacob still sitting by Ethan's side, a look of calm resolve on his face. "Everything's set," Frank said quietly. "We'll move out first thing in the morning." Jacob nodded, his gaze never leaving Ethan's peaceful face. "Thank you, Frank, for everything." Frank offered a small, understanding smile. "Just doing my job. And Jacob, you did good tonight. You kept your promise." Jacob's chest tightened with emotion. "I did, and I'll keep doing it, for as long as it takes." With that, Frank left them to rest, knowing that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but also filled with hope. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Jacob finally allowed himself to relax, his head resting against the headboard as he closed his eyes. He knew there were battles yet to be fought, but for now, they were safe. And that was enough. For now.